Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. This jar of steel spheres sat on a shelf for 30 years and now we're going to turn them into an awesome one-of-a-kind knife. The first order of business is to create a safe and secure environment for these ball bearings to exist in while we heat them up to forge welding temperature. And so we're going to create a steel canister. This is 2x2 inch mild steel tubing with some mild steel end caps, and we'll have to weld this so that it does not come apart when we squish it all in the press. I got these ball bearings from a friend of mine who got them from a millwright. My friend has a service business where he goes to a lot of people's houses and meets a lot of different people, and apparently this guy had these sitting on a shelf for a long time, which is evidenced by the fact that they're in glass jars with metal lids. You don't see that on food containers anymore. And this fella apparently pulled these out of some machinery, a lumber mill, I believe, and now they're going to be turned into a really cool piece that somebody's going to hang on to for a long, long time. Of course, using the white paint to keep the contents from welding to the can, and some guys ask me how much to use, and basically if you can see steel, you don't have enough paint on there. Some of these ball bearings are discolored and some have grind marks on them, and I'm sure what happened is a piece of machinery bound up and the bearing had to be cut apart and removed in order to get things repaired and working again. If you woke up this morning and had breakfast or drove anywhere or lived in a house, then you've benefited from bearings and the steel that they're made of, which is 52-100 steel. Very ubiquitous, as you might imagine, since it's used for so many different things in industry and manufacturing and different products like vehicles and so forth. If you've got something rolling, turning, or moving, chances are it's got a bearing with 52-100 steel in it. Got this canister all filled up with no voids and then all welded up so that it stays together under pressure, making sure that there's a little vent hole in my welds, which for me isn't hard to do. But if you don't have that little candle flame, which is the paint stuff burning off from inside, then you do need to drill a tiny hole so that the canister doesn't blow up in your forge. Using my big 3-burner forge today, since I already had it warmed up from forging some hatchets, which you see there in the foreground. Some guys have had trouble with the canister adhering to the contents despite the white paint. And honestly, I've never had that issue. I run my forge at about 15 psi when I'm forge welding, 15 to 20. And just let it rip, and the temperature is plenty adequate for forge welding everything together, and I've never had the white paint fail me. I have had the stainless steel foil get hot enough to partially forge weld, and so anyway, the white paint is my favorite method of making that can come off like that, and that's what it does. So the corners on your ball bearing canister Damascus are always going to have some kind of cracks or little fissures in it. The linear pressure exerted on the billet immediately upon contact with the press doesn't allow it to really solidly forge weld before experiencing that, so you're going to get little pulled apart spots there, but it's pretty surface level, and as you forge it down, a few more are going to present themselves, and you just grind them out and press on, pun intended. Rounding off this bar, I can make a knife just like it is right here, and it'd be pretty cool. I've done that in the past, but I'm going to take this to another level, and I'm going to twist this billet. Now this is a little nerve-wracking because if the forge weld here is not just about perfect, we don't have, lengths of steel in this. They're all smaller pieces sort of interlocking together at this point since we've drawn it out. But if the forge weld isn't really good, we could just twist this thing apart. So it's a little nervous here. But again, we're getting this up to a good forging heat to make sure that it's going to move as easily as possible and not put any undue stress trying to twist a cold bar. And I don't know how many twists I put on there exactly. I think the number is a whole lot of twists on there. And that's because I want a nice tight pattern. So we'll get this forged down into a nice bar, and then we can start actually working on the blade. I don't actually typically use this particular method, but today I'm going to forge the corner in here and get a bit of a angle there, and then we'll forge the tip around. Get a little bit of a fish mouth developing there. You can correct that by tapping that down straight down on the anvil and forging on. So the edge is going to be on the opposite side of this angle. Using my new 3 3/4 pound hammer I forged in a recent video, and I redressed the faces, and it's working better than it did initially. Kind of cleaned that up a little bit more, got a nice radius, and it's working very nicely. I enjoyed using it. Lighter than I typically use, but still quite effective. So this bar is, it's probably 5/16 inch thick, somewhere in that neighborhood. So we have plenty of material here for a nice blade, and I'm doing a slight counter bend as I begin to forge in the bevel to help with the straightness of the blade as I forge that steel. It's going to be quite a difference between the thickness of the spine and the thickness of the edge, of course, and the difference is greater the thicker your piece of steel is. And so I am doing a little bit of counter bend, as well as, of course, putting in a distal taper. All of these things together are going to provide us with a pretty straight blade instead of a banana-shaped object, because we don't want that. Get that forged in and cut off the excess and create our tang here. The press is nice for this as well. You don't see the tang, but it is still a very important part of the knife, of course. And I want to make sure that it's tapered in on both sides here, thickness and profile wise. So I'm going to dress it up on the anvil. Some final straightening and adjustments at lower heats, and we are getting close to being done forging this blade. And there it is. Pretty decent. Obviously wider and thicker than the finished product is going to be. You got to leave some excess material on there. Ooh, look at that. Bending the blade just through sheer lens power. So now we need to normalize this, begin the heat treat process so that we have a good grain structure, a strong blade that's going to hold an edge and perform well. And then we're going to harden the blade and then, of course, temper it following this. Now you'll see what appears to be the pattern on the blade here out of the quench, what's actually the reverse, because I noticed that the scale always tends to hold on to the nickel content steel, and that's what you're seeing. So the pattern's sort of opposite that. Got this tempered up, and we can begin to grind it, starting with refining the profile and then grinding the bevels. I kind of like doing it this way where there's no grinding involved until after it's completely heat treated, but the bevels are forged in, and so there's not an excessive amount of grinding to do. You have to be careful that you don't overheat the steel at this point. It would be ruined, compromised, not good. So typically I'll dip the blade in the quench bucket every pass to make sure that it does not overheat. So we're getting down to the finer grits here before finishing up the grinding process. And the finer you can go, of course, the easier the hand sanding process is. But I also want to make sure that the bevels on the blade are very consistent and no surface issues with it before I go into hand sanding. And the time has come to hand sand, starting with 220 grit. I'm going to go up to 800 grit on this blade. Using the window cleaner, the ammonia content helps with the sanding process, and there we go. Looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with the way the blade's turning out here. Give myself a reference mark on the plunge line there because I need to grind in the shoulders against which the guard is going to fit. Using the file guide in a soft belt makes quick work of it, and we've got a nicely prepped tang and ricasso area. This will be a brass guard, And you'll notice my fantastic drawing there of what the guard is going to look like. So we'll go with that exactly, I'm sure. Little hacksaw job, and we can center punch the holes for drilling out the slot. First, I'll drill the holes with a 3/16 inch drill bit, and then after I've completed that, I'll flip the guard around and drill the back out with a 5/16 drill bit, but of course not all the way through. This is going to relieve a lot of the material that will allow me to not have to file all of that when I don't need to. And so the actual thickness that's going to contact the tang is probably about 3/16, and so we don't have to fit an entire 3/4 inch bar of brass. Looking pretty good. I think we can go ahead and seat it down with a few taps and do the final fit up of the guard. Using a piece of desert ironwood for the handle, and the way the tang is indexed off of the blade and the way the guard fits, I need to grind the end of the block so that it fits here, and then mark where the tang is going to go so we can drill the block out and fit the knife onto or into the handle wood. These are aircraft drill bits. I don't know why they're called that, but they're the longer ones, and they're handy for drilling out handle blocks. I really like desert ironwood. One thing I don't like about it is how it clogs up your drill bits, and you have to stop almost every pass initially and clean the flutes out, or it will bind up and break the drill bit off, which is rather difficult to correct. And there we go, with a little bit of drilling and a little bit of burning method. We've got the tang fitted into the handle block nicely. I will be installing a brass pin through the handle for added security of construction, and so I need to make sure that the tang is drillable, and since these are 52-100 steel ball bearings, those are a little bit difficult to drill through when they're hardened, and so a dull red heat spheroidizes the steel, and hold the torch on there off and on for a minute or two, and that way I can actually get a drill bit through there. And that's really kind of important when you, especially once you have your handle wood glued onto it. If you can't drill through at that point, you're kind of up a creek unless you get a carbide drill bit, which I don't have. So I've etched the blade in and out of the etchant multiple times, cleaning off the oxides, and that is the last step before fitting the handle together for the final time with epoxy and letting it sit overnight. Now we can begin to profile the handle, and I do that before installing a brass pin with some light peening to make sure that it stays put, as well as epoxy. Now it's just a matter of using various attachments on my KMG grinder to shape the handle and the guard, kind of sculpt it, I guess you could say, and then finish it by hand sanding and finally buffing, making this a nice, comfortable, secure handle. Alright guys, I think this knife turned out pretty cool. I'm going to show you pictures of the whole thing in just a second here. As always, don't forget to support the channel by subscribing, leaving a comment, all that great stuff. Thanks for watching, and we will see you on the next video.